Hello. So it's lovely. It's lovely to be here today in this lovely city, lovely warm weather, and with the lovely Somak Ghoshal.
Thank you for doing this.
You're very welcome. I'm very pleased to be doing this. I've known you, Somak, as a perceptive, literary critic. I'm very pleased to discover in you this wonderful writer of this. Really, it's a beautiful book, a beautifully warm book about the young boy Piku and the loss of his mother. And it's 450 words long, but it traverses this huge range of emotions and memories. And the first question I wanted to ask you, one of the memories is the memory of reading and being read to. And when I was reading that part, when I was reading your story, I remember seeing this little interview with Roald Dahl some months ago, in which he talks about writing for children, how children read, and the intensity with which children read. So when a child, an adult will pick up a book, read it, put it aside. A child will read a book and then read it again, and then read it again, and then read it again, and read it again, like obsessively until the covers are falling off. So, and you're a big reader, of course. How did the memory of your childhood reading influence your writing in this your first book for children?
Um, I think my first memory of reading is, as you said, being read to, and that too by my mother. So that's how I got my love for reading. And after she was gone, I started reading on my own. By that time I was 6.5 years old, so I was literate, and I was reading picture books like this one. And I remember one summer I started reading the Tintin comics. That was the first thing that I started reading obsessively, and I almost learnt all the pages by heart. And because I grew up in the 80s in Calcutta, there was no internet, there was TV, but I grew up in a very strict Bengali family who wouldn't let me watch TV for more than, say, an hour a day or something. So my entertainment was merely reading, and that's how I became obsessed with books and words and writing, actually.
And when you were writing this, were you sort of imagining yourself as a child reading it, or were you imagining yourself as an adult reading it?
It's very hard to kind of, recover that memory of so far back. It's over 30 years, and you don't have very distinct sensations. But what I remembered, so the book that I wrote sort of comes out of an essay which I wrote for adults, which was about summer afternoons and how children who are on holiday for summer vacations from school are kind of, forced to read books. And then how that becomes a habit. So I recovered that sensation of, those intensely hot afternoons, you're sort of sitting in a puddle of sweat and trying to read. So it was more those physical sensations of the afternoon that was, important to me than the act of reading itself, I think.
It was also, I remember that bit in your essay, writing about the intense heat of summer afternoons, and also the sort of intense boredom, for lack of a better word. These endless summer afternoons that stretch on and on and on and on. There's nothing to do. And I was wondering, there was also a kind of restfulness to that boredom. It allowed your brain to slow down. And in a way, perhaps it replicates the kind of empathy that you get from reading, or the empathy that reading nurtures in you. Is that something that you would agree with, or am I showing my age?
No, I completely agree, because I think more than boredom, there was this sort of vast blankness in your life at that time, because there was nothing else. There was no internet, there was no video games, nothing of that sort. So you kind of populated it with characters out of books. So I would, for instance, I read a lot of Bengali books actually at that time. I started reading English much, much later. And Bengal has a very rich tradition of children's writing. So, and they were, they featured characters who were very much like me, middle class boys and girls who were, going into adventures and things like that. So I had instant access to this world of children who were not present in real life, but in books. And that became like almost having imaginary friends. You know, I would think of a character and think, you know, what would this person say to me now if I kind of met them, you know, or what would this person say about this part of my life? Things like that. So it became like a huge sort of consolation to me. I have siblings, but my siblings were very young. So I wasn't growing up in a house full of children or anything. And I was and continue to remain socially very awkward. I was very socially awkward as a child. And I did not like school. You know, I hated school absolutely.
Right. Yeah, I remember so did I. In fact, and if I hated anything more than school, it was homework. So reading was also a way of getting out of having to get to the homework part of things. So you've written this. It's a really beautiful book about a very very difficult subject, and it's about death, and it's about the loss of a parent, and you tell it with the kind of matter of factness and a kind of intensity that perhaps replicates how children themselves react to very distressing situations. And I mean, I realized this when I was writing something of my own. I had written a children's book on Babar, which begins with Babar's father dies, and that's when the story of his life really begins. And I had written it, and then I had to go to a school and read out a bit. And just before I started reading, I thought, oh no, how will I read this out? Will the children get upset? And I read it out, and then suddenly the whole class erupted, and everyone wanted to talk about somebody's grandfather had died, somebody so and so had died, someone died. They wanted to tell me, and at the end there was this little kid right in front of them, round little child. I said, Miss, and I said, what? And he said, nobody in my family has died. And I thought it was just I just wanted to pick him up and hug him. And you get that matter of factness plus that great intensity very well. And I wanted to ask you, is there something about writing for children, and is there something particularly about the form of the picture book that allows for this combination to emerge in a way that perhaps if you were writing a 200-page novel for adults, it might not, or would be more difficult to achieve?
Well, firstly, thank you for reading it that way, because it is true that the emotion in the book is very intense, but also very matter of fact, and it almost doesn't try to engage with what has happened, because I think at that age, if I go far back enough, I don't think I had the words or the emotions to process what had happened to me. And that this was kind of my reaction of not engaging with this part of my life. But yeah, when the picture book started shaping up, I mean, I'm most grateful to my illustrator who has this most beautiful touch, really.
Do you want to show it a bit?
So she transformed the book in ways which I hadn't quite expected. It was 450 words long initially. I was told that you have only 450 words to write the book. And then the way she illustrated the book, a lot of it absorbed the words, basically. And so it became even shorter. It was 450, then it became 350 probably. Like 100 words were sort of absorbed into the images. And I realized that if you work with a very good illustrator, you sometimes don't need to say as much, that you work in conjunction with her imagination, help her out with ideas and flesh it out with her, but you don't necessarily need to put it down in words in the book. So that was a huge lesson in writing and editing that I learned while making a picture book.
Picture gives it a dimension that words alone don't have, and an emotional depth also. But there is also something to the sparseness of the words, because the sometimes the fewer the words, the better chosen they have to be, and the better chosen the words, the more powerful they are. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially as a child, I was not very communicative, so I wasn't a very talkative person. which sounds incredible because I'm talking so much on stage right now. But I was a very silent boy, and my father would have to coax reactions out of me, and just to understand me was like a full-time job for him, like what I wanted at what point. So I could perfectly relate to this format of minimalist text because I also was influenced by a lot of iconic children's books by Oliver Jeffries and people like that who use mostly images to tell stories, maybe just a sentence or a phrase, because they're written for very young readers, people who are just like 3 years old, 3.5 years old, just about learning cat kind of thing. So that's a huge challenge to actually kind of make them understand the narrative using like monosyllabic words. So I was mindful of all these things while I was working on it.
And also that there has to be a narrative, in the sense that there's at least this is something that I learned in the process of writing for children, is that you cannot afford to have any kind of fluff at all. There can be no flab. It has to keep not moving in terms of action, but every moment has to mean something. Otherwise the child disengages.
Why don't you tell us a bit about your book on Babur? It's for children, right?
It's for children.
And
yes.
and how do you convey the complexities of history to children? Like, what is the technique that you use there?
I don't know if I was particularly I don't think I was doing anything very consciously, but I did make an attempt to have the entire story told and to maintain a momentum. I think that was the key to writing that book, to learn how to tell a story with momentum. And in that, then similarly, this kind of the complexity then resolves itself. So then, for example, his father dies, and he's upset, and his grandmother consoles him. But next minute, there's a threat to him from a rival prince or something. So you have to keep moving, and the complexity has to keep moving along with it.
Yeah, because children won't give you a chance to kind of try their patience for 100 pages, and then. Like adults, we persist with novels and think, something will come of it at the end. But
Exactly.
children won't wait that long.
Exactly. But on the subject of on the subject both of reading as a child and of writing for children, you've in that same essay that led to this book, you've written about reading very widely and wildly, even you're reading sort of outer syllabus, whatever you could reach on the bookshelves, and you've written a book about the subject that would be considered difficult. And I remember, reading similarly, like I was allowed sort of to wander through shelves as I willed. But there was always, there does exist this idea that certain things children must be protected from. And not just in the world of writing or in the world of books, but in the world of art, in the world of painting, even perhaps in the world of politics. I was reading, on the way here, I was reading this lovely essay by Samina Mishra. I was talking, there's all these CAA protests that have been going on, and a lot of children are at them. Yeah, and it was beautiful. And she has this little line. She says, what is it? She says, childhood is not another country. It is not a separate compound. So what do you think of this? The idea that children have to be kept apart or protected in some way.
See, I think there are two parts to this, basically. I mean, the country that we are living in now and the times we are living in now, we cannot protect children from what is happening around them. Maybe when I was growing up in the 80s, it was slightly gentler, the time, and parents could still hope to kind of keep children away from a certain kind of experience, not to expose them to the difficulties of life. But now it's no longer possible. I think children have to be made aware of constitutional values and why they are important, and what is going on. And a lot of writing around the CA, to my great joy, is about children being educated by their teachers and parents about the constitution. So in different parts of India recently there were the reading of Constitution for children. So the children's literature community gathered in Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, various parts, and they read the Constitution with some children and tried to explain to them why they were doing it. And to me, that is a huge gesture, like that becomes a more inclusive way of talking about life with children, because ultimately they will be exposed to certain truths and hardships. But if you think of reading age appropriate books, I think there is some merit to it, because at a certain stage in life, we will enjoy a certain kind of book more than we will do now, for instance. So a lot of children's books which I haven't read because I didn't have access to them in the 80s probably. They didn't come into the country as easily as they do now. I'm reading them now, and obviously I'm enjoying them a lot, but not probably with as much keenness as I would have done as a child. So in that sense, I feel that if you're able to direct children towards books they will enjoy at that stage of their lives very much, it's a worthy effort. There is no harm in actually policing a bit of that, you know.
I remember reading A Catcher in the Rye, and I think I was, I don't know, 9 or 10 or something. It was completely age inappropriate, and it gave me a splitting headache. By the end of it, I was just like, what is this book that I... But also, I mean, in the sense that, the more you allow children to choose what they are going to read or what they are going to watch, what they are going to, then it breeds an ability to think for yourself, ability to judge for yourself, how
Exactly.
you want.
And it also gives you a sense of what kind of child you are, probably. Like I had a sort of obsession with horror stories for a long time. And my father just ran out of horror stories to supply, beyond a point, like how many books can you produce, really? And now when I think back on those times, I wonder, like, why I was so obsessed with the horror genre as a child.
What do you think, with your literary critic hat on, what do you think of sort of children's writing landscape in India today? Have you considered it?
So I mostly wrote about adult books until the last few years. I think 3-4 years ago, I started writing more regularly about children's books, and I'm very impressed by, again, like books in India now being written for Indian children. They are not like just reading books imported from abroad, which are about other kinds of children. I'm not saying they don't need to read those books, but I think culturally familiar children's books is a new thing in the Indian market, and I'm very impressed by how this market has grown and it's kind of expanding. Maybe not as much in the picture book segment. I mean, it's still quite an expensive segment. Like, it's very cost sensitive to produce picture books, but text-heavy books, novels, YA books are really, really, really getting interesting in India, I think. So. Yeah, I mean, I now I make it a point to visit the YA section of bookshops and see what they have and, keep up with what is being published, basically.
And publishers also say, from what I hear, that, this is one of the growing part of publishing is children's books, because parents want to wean them away from their gadgets and all of that. But at the same time, I don't know. I mean, again, from my experience of sort of visiting schools and doing readings, I also find that there's a strange, I went to one school and there was, they had a sort of book fair, and the children were allowed 250 rupees to spend on books, which is just a ridiculously little small amount, because you can barely buy one book with that. And I was talking to the teachers later about what else they do in that school and how other kind of extracurricular activities and all that. And she said, well, we do all kinds of things, and also there's this annual annual trip abroad, which will cost every kid maybe 2.5-3 lakhs. They go for 10 days to America or Europe or something and come back. So this idea also exists of sort of spending large amounts of money in order to go to Belgium for a week, is sort of opening or broadening your horizons, whereas reading is still somehow not. Do you think that idea still persists here?
I'm not actually very familiar because I've not done those school rounds and things yet. But I'm not sure. Like, so one of the things which really interests me, and I want to ask you this as well: do you understand children, contemporary children, well enough?
I don't know. I think children, very small children, I suppose, remain more or less the same. The minute they go up above like 10 or 12, I really don't know. I don't know what's going on there.
Because I feel quite intimidated by children sometimes, because they are so quick to pass judgment.
No, and they're very smart. So I was at another school reading the other day, and this was for 9-year-olds, and I do a little workshop because I do about stories about history and all. And one of these, my latest book is about historical figures arriving in the present and sort of helping two little sisters with their issues. So I do a little workshop afterwards in which I say, well, let's write a story about your favorite historical character coming and solving your some problem. And the little kid got up, the young girl from the back, she said, Miss, and I said, what? She said, no, this is the classic conflict resolution plot. And I throw her out of my class. 9-year-old.
How old was she?
9. So in some ways, the kids are precocious. In some ways, they have, and then the slightly older they get, and then this sort of technology takes over. And I've been trying, in fact, now to write for young adults, and that I'm finding far more challenging because I really don't know what is going on in their heads, how they live.
Yeah, I feel that, I'll be boring them if I try to talk to them about anything. So I do feel very worried. Like, I don't think I'm going to write any more for children after this.
No, but you must write more for children after this. It's a beautiful book, and certainly you should write. How does it feel just to go away from this, as this is your first book also, right?
Yeah.
So how does it feel now? You've been a critic, and now you're an author. Are you feeling a sort of slight trepidation or
Not really. I think my greatest pleasure still remains reading, and I call myself a reader rather than anything else, if I had a choice. I didn't expect to write this book. I wrote that essay which you mentioned, and the editors at Pratham Books got in touch with me and said, this is an essay which can become a picture book, because the essay was full of imageries of various kinds. Again, summer afternoons and what happens in those afternoons and things like that. So I started putting it together, just stray phrases and words, and then worked with the illustrator, and all of it came together so beautifully. But I very much feel it was a collaborative effort, so I don't see myself, like, I almost feel I'm half a writer and the other half is my illustrator. So together we have created something, and I don't see that, I feel a bit hesitant about thinking of myself as a writer, still.
I don't know how much do we have. I can't see on that watch exactly how much time we have left. Should we open for questions, or should we?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Should we try with the? Does anyone have any questions?
Otherwise, I'll ask you one, actually. Tell us about your book, for the latest book that you're writing, the historical characters. I found that very interesting.
Oh, this is a book. It's called Ratu and Puri's Adventures in History, and it's basically about these two sisters, and they live right now in the world, and characters from 1857 arrive
Right.
to them sort of magically, and tell them their stories and
do you find it very challenging to talk about history to children now, because there's so much of distortion of history that happens around established facts and how children receive these information?
So no, certainly. There's a sort of unspoken pressure at the back of everyone's heads these days, no? And I think not just when you're writing about children or when you're writing about history, almost when you're writing about anything at all, or for anyone at all, there's, we are living in a sort of combustible world. Given that, and because somehow I've sort of ended up writing about history and history for children, I find that the one idea that I want to, or that I feel in myself wanting to push, if at all that's the right word, is the idea that that history is accessible. It is not something that is handed down from top to below. It is not something that has to be believed in exactly in the way that it is told to you. You can access it for yourself. And it's not something that needs to be, especially when you're writing for children. History, I think, perhaps still remains one of the least favorite subjects in school.
Right.
It's considered sort of boring or abstract, or it's just sort of dates and. But it's only if you have the idea that actually no, it's not just abstraction, it's not just something distant and alien from you. When you have that idea, that's when it can become something that you're wrestling with. Then it just becomes a question of truth versus false, and I will tell you my version and versus somebody else's version. When the minute you think of it something that is accessible and enjoyable, it is something that is in your control. Then it is not threatening anymore.
It's absolutely true. Yeah.
So yeah, but
I suppose it's a huge responsibility as well to be fair to everything, basically all the nuances and
you mean for the writer?
for the writer.
Well, I don't say huge responsibility, but it's not. It's it's the way that you write. I mean, if you don't have a, I think, and at some level, it's really a question of not even accuracy or anything. It's a question of emotional honesty, which is what distinguishes Piku's little world. And I think that sort of when you have it's straightforward emotional honesty, it comes out, particularly when you're writing for children, and you can't deny it, and it's immediately affecting and immediately attractive in that way. So do we have any questions from the audience?
Somak, I wanted to know, you spoke about how it is a collaborative process working with the illustrator. I suppose I wanted to understand how collaborative it was. So was it a question of you having presented a 450 word story which she then fleshed out, and how much sort of back and forth there was? Because now there is a situation where there's a second person who's imagining a world that you had imagined. How much of it would you try to push back and say, no, this is how I had pictured it? Or was it a question of trusting, basically you thought of something and you passed it on and then they've interpreted it? So was there back and forth sort of in that front?
Actually, there was none, because I wrote a story and she took it and illustrated it. And not for a moment I felt that I needed to intervene, because she was entitled to the way she wanted to see. So it's very interesting, it's like already having a reader who is reading the story and bringing it to life with me. So I felt it would be wrong of me to actually intervene at any stage, and I'm not at all unhappy with anything that happened in the book. I didn't have any complaints about any part of it. So it was a very seamless process. She actually, as I said, absorbed a lot of the text into the images. So we removed some of the text to kind of make the images do the talking.
There's something very fantastic about having. It's like having an actor enact them. Suddenly you hear them in different ways, and yeah. Anyway. Any more questions? Yeah.
Ma'am, when you narrate the history, see, at some point of the narration, some history elements we have to choose him, we have to debut him as an villain characters, hero characters. But for some people, the narration would be different. So when you narrate in a history part, for you it would be difficult to choose who as the hero and who as the villain. So when you, example, when you taking the case of the barber itself, you would be barber. So, uh, so you will be saying that some kind of enemies are there. So in some other part or other world, that narration would be, they might feel like that narration should be in different way. I think.
No, no, definitely you're right. I mean, in the sense that heroes and villains are, culture specific, can be, but and I don't see that as being. I mean, when I was writing about Babur, for example, I was writing it from the Babur Nama, from his own writings. So it was kind of his story. So it was about the people that the villains were the people whom he didn't like or he was fighting with. And there was, one of them was this Shehbani Khan, who was an Uzbek who Babur had managed to conquer Samarkand, and then Shehbani Khan came and conquered it back from him. And Babur hated him a lot, and he used to call him the Woodworm King, because he had pockmarks on his face as if he had been bitten by woodworms. So and that I thought was very sort of. I thought that was a nice nickname. Now, obviously, if there's possibly somewhere say Shehbani Khan may be considered a hero, but if I was writing a larger history of Babur for adults in a larger and larger, more complex narrative, then perhaps I would bring in these different, ideas. Like, so I've written for Jahangir for adults, in which there are many different versions of Jahangir that exist. Whether he was a drunkard, whether he was dissolute, whether he was actually a good emperor, whether he was a henpecked husband, whether he was a strong man. Those things exist, and I've tried to bring them in. But when writing for children, I think I enjoyed. I enjoyed having not heroes so much, but villains certainly are very enjoyable to write. So and that, I think that's again for me at any rate, it was part of the momentum of keeping things going. Well, thank you.
Thank you.